Hi, everyone. If you're just joining us, we're going to get started in about a minute or two to let a few more people into the live stream. So welcome. Hi, everyone. My name is Jehanne Dubrow, and I'm thrilled that you're joining me today for a reading from my latest collection, Civilians. Um, I just wanted to say before we get started, there should be a purchase link for Civilians uh, down in the comments section under the video, which includes a 40% discount code from LSU Press. So thank you for joining me today. Civilians functions as the conclusion to a trilogy of books about my experience of being married to a career military officer, what we call being married to the military. When the first of these books, Stateside, which you can see behind me, was published by Northwestern University Press in 2010, it was actually one of the earliest poetry collections to articulate a spouse's perspective of war in the 21st century. And after Stateside came out, I led veterans writing workshops and gave readings at civilian and military institutions around the country. Promoting Stateside allowed me to reflect on the challenge of being both a military spouse and also being an academic, a member of two communities that I quickly learned speak very different and often conflicting languages. And this in turn led me to write the sequel to Stateside, Dots and Dashes, in 2017, which was published by SIU Press and was the winner of the Crab Orchard Series Open Competition Award. With each of these books, I never imagined once I finished them that I would have more to say. But it turned out, even after I wrote Dots and Dashes, that I did. And so with Civilians, I now examine an entirely new stage in a military marriage. After 20 years of service, my husband had retired from the US Navy. And this transition afforded me the opportunity to address what it means when someone who's been trained for war returns to the status of noncombatant. Civilian asks, what happens to the soldier who is no longer a soldier? What happens to the military spouse once physical and emotional distance have been erased and she is reunited with her husband, a man who has been made strange and foreign by his contact with war? So I'm going to start by reading one poem from Stateside and one poem from Dots and Dashes to give you a little taste. And then I'll start reading some poems from Civilians. So this is a sonnet from Stateside. It's called Against War Movies. I see my husband shooting in platoon, and there he is again in MASH. How weird to hear him talk like Hawkeye Pierce. And soon I spot him everywhere, his body smeared with mud, his face bloodied. He's now the star of every ship blockade and battle scene, the Fighting 69th, A Bridge Too Far, Three Kings, Das Boot, and Stalag 17. In Stalingrad, he's killed, and then he's killed in Midway and a few good men. He's burned or gassed, he's shot between the eyes, or shoots himself when he comes home again. Each movie is a training exercise, a scenario for how my husband dies. So this too is a sonnet from Dots and Dashes. And it's based on a real fact that there used to be on the ground floor of the Pentagon a beautiful chocolate shop filled with chocolates in very interesting shapes. So this poem is called From the Pentagon. He brings me chocolate from the Pentagon, dark chocolate shaped like tanks and fighter jets, milk chocolate tomahawks, a bonbon like a Kirsch grenade, mint chocolate bayonets. He brings me chocolate ships, a submarine descending in a chocolate sea, a drone unmanned and filled with hazelnut praline. He brings me cocoa powder, like chocolate blown to bits, or chocolate squares of pepper heat. Or if perhaps we fought, he brings a box of truffles home, missiles of semi-sweet dissolving on the tongue. He brings me Glocks and chocolate mines, a tiny transport plane, a bomb that looks delicious in its cellophane. And for me, that's a poem that brings together Eros and Thanatos, the presence of love and death, which are, of course, in some ways, the two essential qualities in a military marriage. This next poem is the opening poem in Civilians, and it plays on the idea of those anniversary gifts that are themed. You know, one year you give paper, another year you give lace. So this poem is called What Do You Give the War That Has Everything? The first year, we were told, is always the most difficult, a neutral zone of afternoons and nights. Dear war, we said, we are sending ourselves folded inside gilded envelopes. We have stamped your name in wax. By the second year, we'd learned to rip the bed sheets into strips for bandages. This is the gift of cotton, we said, that it soaks whatever seeps. Soon there was leather. Soon there was linen, the wood we burned when supplies were cut to the front. And later there was iron, melted red and molded into spears, the fruit shape of grenades. In the seventh year, we gave the war a heavy blanket made of wool. Never mind, we said, the smell of other bodies in the folds. We forgot the year of bronze. Year 9, we offered up the decorative, a piece of pottery painted with a chariot, a dead king dragging through the dirt. The war broke our presents into shards. After that were years of tin and steel, the tear of silk like a flag the horses trample on, then lace, as with the tender bodice of a girl. In the 14th year, there was ivory, because why not pull down the giants of the world? And next, a crystal cup for drinking victory, a porcelain plate to serve a traitor's head. In year 25, we engraved the war on silver. This is costing us too much, we said. We barely counted then the years of pearl and coral, the ruby like a puncture wound, the poison blue of sapphire set in gold. The war took anything we had to give. Decades on, we gave emeralds for the green of some forgotten field. We gave the war a diamond to honor its cleave and glittering, its dreadful way of capturing the light. There are a number of poems in Civilians that simply have the title Civilian. And what I was trying to do with these poems was to gradually arrive at a definition or an understanding of what a civilian is. When I was writing this book, I looked up the definition of civilian, and it's very interesting. A civilian is someone who is not a soldier. A civilian is a non-combatant. In other words, civilian is defined by negation. And I couldn't help wondering what would it mean to enter an identity that's defined by what it is not. So this is civilian. It's a villanelle. I bring the war into my bed each night and let it press metallic to my cheek. I barely move beneath the trembling light that it emits, a semaphore both bright and shadowy, its message is oblique. I bring a war into my bed. Each night it floats across the sheets toward me. Despite the little swells of fear, I never speak. I barely move beneath the trembling light, the bite of sea salt on my lips, the slight unnerving sound of waves, the anchor's creak. I bring his war into my bed each night, anticipate its sonar ping, invite its touch. I know the heat its missiles seek. I barely move. Beneath the trembling light, I am a target in the line of sight. I am a shore toward which the cruisers streak. I bring our war into my bed each night and barely move beneath its trembling light. I wanted in Civilians to have a poem that in some ways briefly summarized the entire history of war. So this is epic war poem. What else but a soldier raging by his shield? What else but the dutiful? What else but a battle muraled on a wall and Troy a piece of artifice to gaze upon? What else but the voice, a garment shredded in its grief? What else but ash? What else but men on wooden ships for centuries? Their keening is an arrow to the throat. What else but kings? What else but the trebuchet of years? What else but sawbuck fences leaning near a field? What else but America? What else but daguerreotypes? A line of corpses posed within the frame. What else but the guns? What else but the trenches stuck with mud? What else but modernity and the long parade of after? What else but cinders mixed with milk while the scorched are drifting, processed into smoke? What else but the skirmishes of scholars, language too little and too much? What else but brief eras of indifference when the dead are left alone? What else but the forged and hammered things of poetry, all the failures of our making? What else but the litany of bombs? In every poetry collection, I always try to have at least one ekphrastic poem. And that's partly because I always tell my students that when we get stuck in our own stories, it often helps to look outward. And looking at a piece of art and then engaging it can often lead to surprising discoveries about the self. So this poem is inspired by a painting by Winslow Homer, painted in 1865. It's oil on canvas, and it's called Veteran in a New Field. Already he has worked like this for hours, moving his scythe beneath the gold horizon. There's stillness here. There is the swirl of wheat, both what's been cut and what remains standing, and the blade not so different from a bayonet, a useful edge that's made of steel. Although it's best to forget everything except the green and yellow glimmering brushstrokes of orange deeper in the field. What a little speckling of red there is at the root. Mostly there's sky, a shade of blue that might be called his child's eyes, or the blue of a broken shell he once found tumbled from a nest. There's the sweat that leaves a shadow on his shirt and his uniform coat thrown far to the corner of the frame and the shape of his old canteen. Later, he will lift the dark metal to his mouth and drink until he barely tastes the dust. He'll keep his gaze directed at the dirt behind him, the labors of the day laid flat, and the grain giving way before him, falling no heavier, than light across the ground. Throughout these three collections, Stateside, Dots and Dashes, and Civilians, I've written sonnets that engage with small artifacts of war. So, for instance, in earlier books, I write about what are known as the Armed Services editions. These were tiny little books that were designed to fit into the uniform pockets of, um, of soldiers. And these books were not meant to last very long. They were basically printed on pulp. And I just was inspired with an artifact such as this one to think about the stories that we tell through these artifacts, through these historical objects. In Civilians, there's also a poem about this little object, which is a clicker. It makes a sound like a cricket, and it was used by the forces landing on D-Day to signal to one another in the dark, to signal to each other that they were friends. And then I also write about one of these, which is a trench whistle used in the First World War. And it was used by officers to signal that it was time for their men to go over the top and to run across essentially no man's land, often toward their deaths. So this sonnet is called Trench Whistle. I call my dogs with it, a blast of sound that summons them from far across the grass. And they come running at the trill, each hound a blur of lead-gray fur, a yipping mass. They only know the pleasures of the lawn, the clovered fragrances. This cry I make is like a strident bird that's quickly gone, the branch now bare, the air that seems to shake with what was there before. They can't conceive. This whistle mobilized whole companies of men. Its voice was sharp enough to cleave the clamor of the front, the batteries of mortar rounds. I call, and each dog runs, unhunted by the terror of the guns. As you may have noticed, the cover of Civilians is this incredible purple color. And this purple is inspired by the next poem I'm going to read, which is called Tyrian Purple. And Tyrian Purple was the purple that was created for royalty. And it was created by essentially boiling the shells of mussels. And the boiling pulled that purple color out of the shells. So this is called Tyrian Purple. Please understand, to heave Hector through the dirt, Achilles must first cut holes in his enemy's heels. Hector, threaded like a needle with leather cord and tied to a chariot that will pull him around the walls. Imagine a body strong enough to be strung like this. Imagine such stitching is an art, and we call it battle. Andromache deep in the palace is weaving a cloak on a wide loom, wool like the amethyst shadows beneath her eyes, that vivid sleeplessness. She's tacking flowers to the fabric when she hears the weeping everywhere in Troy. The bobbin unspools from her fingers because the warp is a place of order and death the cutting shears. Who can blame Andromache if she sits at the loom for hours, rectangular world where nothing extends beyond the cloth's perimeter? At this point in the war, everyone has lost the thread of narrative. Any reason beyond armor and the carrion birds with their beaks like sharpened secateurs. Who wouldn't want to take up some craft, pottery perhaps, or painted scenes on funerary stones? Don't hands need occupation when the city is besieged? Probably a reader believes it frivolous. These fibers dyed the plum of galaxies, all that great oppressive sky, and the murdered looking down from their fixed constellations. Even a wife must find a pastime. It's late in our history to condemn the way people spin out a war, if they twist the days like fibers on a spindle. Imperial purple, purple of bruised loyalties, unfadable purple that stains the maker's skin. For me, in some ways, that's one of the ars poeticas of the book. It's a reflection on what it means to write about war and how the poet is stained in the process of writing about war, how that trauma stains her as well. This next poem is called Domestic Policy. Today, I didn't say divorce because I was sickened by the news from Afghanistan, translators and their families left waiting at the gates while American personnel lifted off in the wide indifference of their transport planes. I said divorce because I hadn't made space in the cabinet for my husband's things, and he was angry I did not leave a vacancy for what he carried home from war. I was tired of him stacking bowls on the top rack of the dishwasher, a policy I can't abide when the lower rack is an open country waiting to be washed clean. Forgive me, reader, for the weakness of my marriage. I didn't say divorce because my husband would rather a drone hover above a wedding procession, the party far below, embroidered dresses glinting, small mirrors sewn into the hems. He prefers a pilot fire from a distant, unendangered screen. And I believe killing should come with the risk of dying for the killers. But that's not why I said divorce. Forgive me, reader, for the poems of closets and kitchens. Marriage is not two ideologies fighting at a table while the soup goes cold on the spoon. Marriage is two people shouting about spices, the ordering of jars by alphabet or continent, as if everything depends on an ounce of turmeric fading under glass. Perhaps I said divorce for all the wrong reasons. Forgive me for scrubbing the pot with a bristled brush. My fury at the gold-stained enamel is almost the same size as my rage that somewhere a helicopter strikes on civilians in the dark. Forgive my sentiment. All I can do is keep scraping the dried burning from the pan. And that too, I see as another ars poetica in the book. It's an argument that these collections I'm writing aren't so much engaged with US foreign policy, but are rather studies of marriage under extreme duress. So I'm going to close with two poems. The first poem is a kind of riff on the Pledge of Allegiance, but for the little nation of a marriage. It's called Pledge. Now we are here at home in the little nation of our marriage, swearing allegiance to the table we set for lunch or the wind chime on the porch, its easy dissonance. Even in our shared country, the afternoon allots its golden lines so that we're seated both in shadow on opposite ends of a couch and two gray dogs between us. There are acres of opinions in this house. I make 2 cups of tea, 2 bowls of soup, divide an apple equally. If I were a patriot, I would call the blanket we spread across our bed the only flag. Some nights we've burned it with our anger at each other. Some nights we've welcomed the weight, a woolen scratch on both our skins. My love, I am pledging to this republic for however long we stand. I'll watch with you the rain's arrival in our yard. We'll lift our faces together toward the glistening. And this is the final poem I'm going to read. It's the last poem in the book as well. It's another civilian poem. Civilian. These days, I'm mostly grateful he's one of us no longer. A piece of metal stamped with his name, identifying facts. He no longer jangles the click of steel to steel, no more in service to a ship or the gray machinery of the state. Now, when we touch, I can feel his edge worn down and barely miss the keenness of his mouth. I remember, for decades, he wore 2 tags around his neck, one to leave with the body, the other, perhaps, brought back to my hands. Thank you so much. And I'd be glad to take some questions now if there are any from the audience.
Thank you. Our first question, at the beginning, you mentioned having more to say and not thinking that you necessarily would have more to say on a topic and then continuing with it. How did you know, at what point did you know that there was going to be another book in these thoughts? And it wasn't just, I have another poem or another two poems about this. When did it become a book?
Yeah, so after I wrote Stateside and published it, I was a very young poet at the time. And I think I sort of was engaged in a kind of hubris, like you write the book and that's the end of the story. Uh, but then I was reading from stateside around the country and I was having these really provocative experiences. In many cases, I realized the poems I was writing weren't satisfying anyone. When I read in military communities, they were often frustrated with me that I was breaking a kind of silence that military spouses aren't supposed to break by articulating that a military marriage can be extremely difficult. And then when I was in academic spaces, there was often a discomfort with the fact that I was married to somebody in the military. I was seen as in some way participating in the military industrial complex. So that kind of collision of experiences began to gnaw at me. And usually there's a point when an idea is bothering me enough that I'll start to write a poem or two. And if I keep finding that I have another poem that comes out after the first two or three, then I'll start to ask myself, oh, is there something more here? After Dots and Dashes was published, when I did write about military service, it was often in my nonfiction, in my essays. And so I really thought, the things that I have left to say on this subject are now going to be in prose. Big, clunky ideas that often don't work for poems, but might work within the expansive space of an essay. And then when my husband was in his final year of service, I started to realize this is going to be a radical transformation, much greater than I had recognized at first. That moving from being an active duty service member to being a civilian was going to be a metamorphosis. And it was that thought that led me to start rereading Ovid's Metamorphoses again. I hadn't looked at the book in maybe 20 years. And I started to think about the fact that this transition to civilian life was going to be, in some ways, as radical as a girl named Daphne transforming into a laurel tree. So at that point, I really started reading Metamorphoses with a thought toward in what way can the classics again inform my writing as the classics had for the two previous collections. And very quickly after I started asking that question, the poems began to happen, and I realized, oh, this is a third, I won't say final, but this is a third examination of a military marriage that's going to do something very different than the two previous books did. But usually it's that I write poems, and eventually I've written so many that it suddenly dawns on me, oh, this is a book. And then a very different kind of work begins in which I'm sort of determinedly thinking about the shape of this thing I'm putting together and beginning to ask larger questions about structure and the act of storytelling that I'm engaged in.
Thank you. As a follow-up to that, you mentioned with the previous books in the trilogy, the responses that you got from folks listening to your reading. Can you talk about how responses have been different over the three books? I know that this one is new, but what the differences are in the reactions that you get from people in military communities or even outside of military communities?
I actually think they've been really consistent in general, that military spouses seem to be grateful to have their experiences represented in art. Because historically, the military spouse was largely written to in a didactic way or maybe in self-help books like Chicken Soup for the Military Wife's Soul, that kind of thing. And so to have the military spouse experience represented in poetry, I think elevates the experience as art aspires to do in general. Often, active duty service members were divided. Some were grateful and some were hostile. Um, and then in the community where I spend a lot more time, the literary community, there were real divisions. I think there's an expectation that if you're writing a contemporary poem about war, that it has to be didactic and has to take a very clear political stance. And while I know what my politics are, and I know that I'm a liberal and am opposed in general to America's incursions overseas, those are actually not the poems I was interested in writing. So sometimes within the literary community, I would be reprimanded for writing poems about marriage instead of writing poems about American foreign policy. And that's why I read that one poem today in which I talk about this idea that marriage is not two ideologies. It's really two people arguing about the small stuff of daily life. For me, these collections are ultimately a kind of metaphor about marriage and long-term relationships in general. In a military marriage, my experience has been that I've come to understand that no matter how well I understand my husband, there's a part of him that I will never fully grasp. And that's his military service that for me, I can't comprehend. I struggle to understand why he found that work rewarding, but he did. And I've had to learn to be okay with not fully understanding somebody who I love so much. But I think this fact is true in any relationship. There's always a part of the other person that remains unreachable. So ultimately, that's what these books are about for me. Yes, they're about the specificity of a military marriage, but they're also about these larger questions having to do with intimacy and distance in any relationship where you feel you should know someone fully.
Thank you. That's so interesting. Our next question here is about forms within the book. So the book obviously blends formal with free verse. For example, we heard of Villanelle today. Can you talk about your process and how you decide whether a poem is going to be in a certain form, or do you sort of get partway through and then decide to change it, or sort of how does that process look for you?
It can be either or both. So I love writing prompts, and often I will give myself a writing prompt. And even though I started out as a formalist, um, there are still moments in my writing life where I think to myself, oh, I don't remember how to write in meter anymore, or can I still write a sonnet? And so I'll doubt myself, and often then I'll give myself the assignment of write a sonnet about X, or write 50 lines of blank verse, or do write a poem in common meter. Um, and so that's one way that often a poem will end up in a fixed form. Uh, but very frequently, the poem will tell me what form it wants to be. And in this collection, I think there's a pretty even balance between free verse and the use of fixed and received forms. Stateside was a much more sort of had the much more clearly marked military meters in it. So Stateside was a much earlier book when I was in general largely working in traditional forms. And I think as I've grown as a poet, and grown more comfortable with experimenting across forms and with different kinds of lines, I've become more organic in my thinking about what the poem will teach me in terms of form. And I also think this is closely connected to my comfort with revealing intimate stories. With Stateside, I was really learning how do I tell these intimate stories of marriage? And that was a difficult lesson for me. And I think now, basically 20 years later, with civilians, I'm more comfortable with writing poems that appear to be extremely revealing and personal. And so that ease has allowed me to be a little bit more relaxed formally as well, or to have a more organic process in terms of when I write in rhyme and meter and when I choose to write in free verse.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot today about how that there's been a trilogy of three books on this sort of thread. What you're working on now, is it similar? Is it different? What are your next projects looking like?
So I become very easily bored with my own voice on the page. And so I usually have 2 to 3 projects going at the same time. Um, in fall of 2025, I have my first craft book coming out. It's called The Wounded Line, A Guide to Writing Poems of Trauma. And in some ways, I've been working on this book for 20 years, at least in my head. I was trained in Holocaust studies, war literature, and trauma studies. And this book is the result of my thinking over the past 2 decades, especially in the classroom, about what are the best practices and strategies for representing trauma on the page, making arguments about trauma, showing what the traumatized mind looks like in a poem. So that's the first thing that's sort of on the way. I'm I just finished a book length essay that's divided into 101 parts, and it's called Frivolity, a Defense. And hopefully that book will be out next year or the year after. And this is a book that continues some of my earlier work. My first book of nonfiction was actually a book about how I fell in love with the art and science of scent. And frivolity is a continuation of that examination. Why is it that that frivolous things can be so important to us, especially in dark times, dark political times? Why is it frivolity can sustain us in those moments where everything feels completely serious and unfrivolous? And then I'm working on a book of poems called The Brief Temple Taken Down, which is about the relationship between the health of the body and the health of the body politic. And this book began with my mother, who had a terrible year in which she had 2 extreme health crises. And I began to think about the way my mother was essentially the spine of our family. Uh, And then I started to think about what it would mean if she were no longer here for our family. And that led me to start thinking about other ways in which I was seeing um, unhealthy things affect the stability in my life. And that's how I came to think about, you know, the health of individual bodies and the health of the body politic that we're all part of. And that book's also very much engaged with thinking about Jewish liturgy, um, contemporary anti-Semitism, especially here in this country, uh, and ways in which specifically the Jewish body might currently be in danger. And then finally, I'm on in the very early stages of a collection of essays called The Red Monsters, which is a book about how the monstrous can teach us to love the scary parts of ourselves. And this book began with a long essay that I wrote about my grand passion for Anne Carson's novel in verse, Autobiography of Red, and what that book taught me about my own monstrousness. So those are the things that are on the horizon for me.
That's a long list. You're busy. Okay. We have another question that's more of an autobiographical question. So as much or as little as you want to respond is fine. But from Michelle in the comments, we have, how did you meet your husband, and is he supportive of your books?
Yeah, my husband and I went to a school called St. John's, which is often known as the Great Books School. You read the classics there. And what's very funny is it's right across the street from the US Naval Academy. It's in Annapolis. And we met our senior year. We were in 2 classes together. We were in lab class and language class. And I remember in language class, we were reading the French poet Baudelaire. And everyone in class was horrified by my interpretations of Baudelaire's poems, which are highly erotic, sensual poems. But everybody thought I was like inventing all the eroticism in these poems. And my husband was the only person who would sit next to me um, after I scandalized the rest of my classmates with my close readings of these poems. And so that's how we fell in love. And we were college sweethearts, and then we broke up for 8 years. And I like to say that we both did some window shopping. And after 8 years, it was clear that neither of us was going to love anyone else. And so we got back together and were married quite quickly after that. Um, and my husband's always been incredibly supportive of my work. With these three books, I would always show him poems in the collections, often to make sure that I was getting the language of the military right, or getting, if I was writing about a piece of like naval technology, I always wanted him to look at the poem to make sure that it was accurate. I wouldn't necessarily ask him for feedback on like, hey, does this poem depict the experience as you remember it? Because the poem is an interpretation. But he's been incredibly supportive, and we've even done events together. I remember one time we went to the US Naval Academy in Annapolis and visited a bunch of classes, and the students had as many questions for me about poetry as they did for him about his service. And so those have been amazing experiences, and I think I'm really lucky that he's supportive of my work, because not every poet has a supportive spouse. So yeah, I mean, I like to joke that he's my muse for these three books, and I don't know how he feels about that. But he's certainly tolerant of it.
Thank you so much. That is our last question, so we can go ahead and say thanks and goodbye to the audience.
Thank you, everyone. And again, the link to buy the book is on Facebook with a 40% discount coupon. Thank you so much.